How reliable is memory? Well, the answer to that question is not very, apparently. People like to think that their memory is reliable, but it isn't. They constantly overestimate their own capacity to remember. I say people rather than we because I'm fully aware of how unreliable my own memory is. I have only vague recollections of my childhood. And similarly, my recollections of holidays or other times in my life are pretty sketchy. I remember when I've been away on holidays with someone, and perhaps some years later, that person says to me, "Do you remember when we did this? Do you remember when we did that?" And my answer is no. I would never consider writing a memoir. I'd have to make so much of it up. But people often claim high reliability for their memory. But frankly, unless you're some kind of savant, I take this with a pinch of salt. My mother would always claim to remember her childhood vividly. Pinch of salt. I've edited many memoirs in which people give precise and detailed accounts of events and even verbatim conversations from many years ago, which they claim to remember with almost video-perfect memory. Unless they've kept a contemporary journal or they have other written, photographic, video or audio evidence, pinch of salt, I'm afraid. I never communicated this to my mother or any of these memoirists, but the scepticism was and is firmly in place. Even if you've kept a contemporary journal and written down every day the events of that day and the conversations that you've had during that day, if you've written all this down in the evening in your journal, still a pinch of salt, I'm afraid. Sorry if it seems that I doubt some superpower that you claim to possess, but I do. Broadly speaking, there are two types of memory, or perhaps I should really say two types of recollection. I'm thinking of long-term memory here. There's reproductive memory, which consists of rote information, and it's pretty accurate generally. It's unlikely to result in errors. Things like memorizing the times table, or world capitals, or winners of the Oscar for Best Picture for every year. These are things we consciously commit to memory, because, like me, you love going to trivia nights. Of course, your memory can fail you there too. There's nothing quite as frustrating at a quiz night as forgetting something on a list that you've so carefully and painstakingly memorized. But with time and reinforcement, these can become pretty fixed in place. Even so, we can still have those damn tip of the tongue moments when we simply can't retrieve the information. It's still in there though, and it will come to us eventually. In addition to this, there is reconstructive memory, or reconstructive recollection, which is when we try to recall events from the past in detail. It's an active process of filling in missing elements, usually, and this is significantly prone to error, more so than we'd like to admit. This is what happens when someone tells you stories about their childhood, or about something that happened on a recent holiday, or when you're required to give an eyewitness account of an accident that you witnessed. In a classic paper from 1974, subjects were shown film footage of a traffic accident, or a series of traffic accidents, and then asked questions about what they'd witnessed. The researchers were particularly interested in how well people were able to estimate the speed of the vehicles involved. Not well, apparently. But this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with memory, it's just that we can't estimate speeds very well. However, interestingly, their estimate of the speed varied depending on how the question was phrased. So, if the question was phrased in terms of how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other, people tended to give a higher value than if they were asked how fast they were going when they hit each other. The phrasing of the question introduced bias into their response. More interestingly, though, in terms of memory, a week later the subjects were asked another set of questions, and embedded among these was this: did you see any broken glass? Those who had heard the word smashed were significantly more likely to say yes than those who had heard the word hit. There was no glass. So memories seem to be easily biased in one direction or another. It's worth noting, though, that even some people who heard hit said yes, they did see glass. People expect to see broken glass at a car accident, so they subsequently remember seeing it. A 2007 paper explored the effect of bias on people's recollection. So they gave a questionnaire to a number of female students at the beginning of the school year to determine the extent to which they held the belief or the bias that men were better at maths than women. And 3 months later they were asked to evaluate their own performance. And they were far more likely to underestimate their own reported marks in maths if they showed that initial bias towards believing that men were better. So even something very personal to you, something you might be clearly expected to remember, can be clearly affected by bias. In this case, a bias towards the belief that males are better at maths than females. If students believe this, they misremembered their own marks in maths, underestimating them. We can even struggle to remember things that we're exposed to very frequently over a long period of time. For example, a 2015 study found that only 1 in 85 participants, 1 in 85, were able to correctly recall the Apple logo. And half of all participants failed to identify the logo correctly when it was placed among a set of similar designs. Hard to believe, right? But again, the trivia buffs among us will know the frustration of being shown a series of logos or products, sometimes things we've seen time and time again over the years, and being unable to identify them. This may be attributed to something called inattentional amnesia, which may be the result of overexposure, so that after a while we just cease paying attention. But I think in my own case, this is the result from my never having paid attention. It's simply not something I feel inclined to give any of my attention to. And this is clearly important when we're recalling events of all kinds. We're not going to recall details of events that we paid no attention to at the time. Note also that the people in this study were very confident about their ability to identify the logo. Their actual performance suggested that this confidence was seriously misplaced. But again, people tend to be far more confident in their own memory than the actual evidence suggests. Again, in trivia terms, one of the types of challenges that's sometimes presented is that we're shown an image for maybe 30 seconds, and we're then asked a question about the image. How many women were wearing wedding rings in that photograph? What was the colour of the elephant in the top right corner? Even when given options to choose from, my own performance in this kind of thing is terrible. I probably didn't even see the elephant. Of course, when we're trying to recall past events in some detail, as for instance we might when we try to recall what we did on day 2 of our holiday in Florence, we can easily start filling in the missing gaps, as did the witnesses of the accidents who saw glass there when there was none. We desperately want to remember, so we do. We confabulate. This is the process of making stuff up to fill in the blanks. We do this with our recollections of dreams, I think. I'm always a bit suspicious of people who claim to be able to remember their dreams in detail. Not only do we fill in the gaps, but we adjust events so that they're more coherent and make more sense, which real dreams usually are not and do not. We do the same with our memory of real events. Confabulation is often associated with brain injury and other cognitive deficits, but it occurs in normal memory too. I would suggest that we do it all the time. Now, I'm not saying that this involves intentional lying, except maybe to ourselves. We really believe what we think we remember. These things are as certain and clear to us as the actual memories. In a way, these memories are us. The us of that time period anyway. Hence we may be offended if anyone challenges our memories. Best not to, I suggest. Just nod and smile and think, pinch of salt. As is often the case, I think the important thing here is to be self-aware. Be aware that your own recollection of events is likely to be no more and no less accurate than your partner's account or that of your bitterest enemy. Have that pinch of salt handy for your own memories too.